Well, first, let me begin by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Depending on where you are in the world, any of those might be appropriate. I happen to be in California. You can probably see on my screen that it's 5:06 a.m. right now. One of the things that is changing as a result of this pandemic is not only are we not able to shake hands, in fact, we may never again shake hands. That's one of the possibly permanent changes that will happen in our culture. But we're also going to be engaged an awful lot more in the future in these kinds of digitally mediated interactions. I don't think that this is a temporary change. I think that there's really substantial and permanent changes happening in our culture. So the title of my talk reflects this idea that, we're becoming, in some sense, digital humans. And this brings a new urgency to the digital humanism perspective. So digital humanism is something that Hannes has particularly been, I think, a worldwide leader in this area. He led the development of the Vienna Manifesto on digital humanism, which I think is a wonderful statement of principles. And this movement was fueled by what people acknowledge as very widespread threats to democracy, mediated by technology, the future of work, the fact that technology may be supplanting an awful lot of the jobs around us, and threats to privacy. And these are all very significant threats. And then this happened, where we now face this very rapid change in our worldwide culture that's driven by a coevolutionary process, really, where a virus appeared and mutated and basically took over the world in a way that has been rather dramatic and very quick. I would like to argue that a pandemic is not a war. Now, this picture is actually in my book. It's not that I anticipated the pandemic. This is not a COVID-19 diffusion. This is the diffusion of the WannaCry ransomware internet worm in 2017. It has some remarkable similarities with the propagation of the coronavirus, but it's not about the coronavirus at all. It's about the diffusion of a technological pandemic. And the point that I'm making here is that in some ways, technology and its relationship with humans is in many ways rather analogous to the relationship that humans have with the biological entities around us. And this is a pretty significant theme in my book. Now, the question that I would like to address today is, are we really turning into digital humans? So here's a snapshot from a group meeting that I had recently. One of the things that has changed is that my research group is now scattered around the globe. So these people are not all in Berkeley. Some of them, due to the artifacts of Zoom, have only a part of their heads. There's lots of interesting artifacts. The Berkeley campus is going to hold a graduation in Minecraft this weekend. So here is a snapshot of the Berkeley campus. The students have gotten together and actually constructed a really remarkable replica of the Berkeley campus in this video gaming infrastructure in order to hold a virtual graduation this weekend. And we're learning, all of us, how to interact through these technology mediums. It's a struggle for many of us. I think this particular snapshot I took while I was conversing with one of my graduate students just earlier this week. And one of the interesting things to notice is that he's looking directly at my eyes on his screen, and I'm looking directly at his eyes on my screen, and neither of us is looking at each other. And this very fundamentally human aspect of interacting with someone and making eye contact is really missing there. One of the things that I've learned, for example, is when I give a talk like this, I have a tendency not to look at the camera. If I look at the camera directly, I make eye contact with you, or at least you think you get the perception that I'm making eye contact with you. I am actually missing that perception altogether from my side, and it makes an interaction between human beings really quite different from the way that it used to be, okay? It's not the same as an in-person interaction. So as we develop a technology-mediated society, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to education? I'm very concerned about the fact that one of the biggest university systems in the world, the California State College system, just announced that they're going 100% online in the fall semester. I expect that Berkeley will be, if not 100% online, heavily online in the fall. And I'm wondering how much of that change is going to be temporary. What are going to be the changes to democracy? How are we going to handle voting? What about young people dating? What is happening to society? So the memes that I'd like to emphasize today is that technology has a huge impact on humanity. I won't insult you to, try to develop that point further. I think everyone knows that. What might be a little more subtle is that we have less control over the development of technology than we think. And the third point is that we are not, in fact, digital. And as a consequence, when we interact digitally, things change in very fundamental ways. So let me start with the first two. Okay, I'll bundle these two together. Technology has a huge impact on society, and we have less control than we think. So my book is about coevolution. And in this book, I coined the term digital creationism. Now, I'm a software engineer, really, at heart. I've been developing software for 40 years. I started writing embedded software in the 1970s. And for almost my entire career, I thought of every piece of software that I created, every program that I created, as a creative work emanating from my own cognitive mental processes. That's how I understood it. It was my work. I now understand that that's actually not the case. Every piece of software that I created during that entire 40 years was a mutation of previously created pieces of technology. And so in my book, I coined the term digital creationism for the thesis that technology is the result of top-down intelligent design. And I present an alternative thesis, which is that actually technology is co-evolving in very much a Darwinian way with humanity. We don't like seeing our mental cognitive processes as themselves cogs in a relentless, purposeless evolution, but it may be that that's what they are. This is a provocative point that I make in my book, and I think you'd have to read the book to get the full defense of it, but I'm going to give you a few of the highlights. So one of the things that I dive into is, what is coevolution? It turns out that I myself had a very naive view of how Darwinian evolution occurs. And in researching this book, I read quite a bit of evolutionary biology. One book that I read that I would particularly recommend because it's very accessible is this book by David Quammen called The Tangled Tree. And it explains that biological evolution isn't as simple as we once thought. So in particular, I used to think that biological evolution occurred where you had random mutations. So a DNA molecule would be mutated by some random event like an alpha particle or a chemical. And some of these random mutations would result in a better fitness in the resulting creature, which would then go on to propagate. Turns out that's not actually how it works. Evolutionary biologists have discovered quite a number of other mechanisms in biology. So one of these is horizontal gene transfer. And this one is understood now to be central to the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It turns out that if you just look at the statistics, that the random mutation that I used to think is how evolution occurred simply can't explain the rapidity with which antibiotic-resistant bacteria develop. So horizontal gene transfer is one of the mechanisms in biology where you have a virus, in particular a bacteriophage, which is a very common kind of virus that attacks bacteria. So the way that the virus works is it invades the bacterial cell, it hijacks its genetic mechanisms, it destroys the cell, and in the process it replicates itself. And the replicas carry off pieces of DNA from that bacteria. When one of those replicas of the virus carrying that piece of DNA from the bacteria approaches another cell, it turns out that sometimes it will not destroy that cell, but it will affect the genetics of that cell and splice into the genetic code of that new bacterium a piece of the genetic code of the old bacterium. So how does this relate to technology? Well, I have learned that software development actually proceeds a lot like this. A software developer doesn't start with a blank slate and create something out of nothing as a top-down intelligent design process. Instead, what a software engineer does is what I call horizontal code transfer. You take snippets of code from libraries like the standard template library, the Java library, Python modules, JavaScript modules. You pull down code from GitHub, you look on Stack Overflow for best practices for how to do things, and you are really functioning a bit like a virus here, stitching together pieces of code from various sources to create a new mutation of that technology. So another thing that I learned about biological evolution is this thesis of endosymbiosis, which was first brought to respectability by Lynn Margulis. So in this thesis, it says that, okay, the cells in plants and animals, which are called eukaryotic cells, are distinctly different from bacterial cells. In particular, the cells in the human body and in plants and all animals have organelles. They've got a nucleus, they've got a mitochondria, et cetera. So Lynn Margulis developed this thesis that the way that those cells emerge was not because of some random mutation that tried out various ways of doing organelles, but rather it came from a merging of a symbiotic relationship between two prokaryotic cells which didn't have the organelles to begin with. So you could think of it in a cartoon-like way as a bacterium swallows another one, and instead of digesting it, makes it part of its own metabolic system. And it becomes a self-replicating eukaryotic cell. You can take this thesis further and use it to understand the development of multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms come about from first forming a symbiotic colony, and then that colony eventually becomes an entity in and of itself, a self-replicating entity in and of itself. So humans are doing this with technology today. In effect, we're integrating them into our very being in ways that is really creating a new entity altogether, which is humans and technology together. So many of the people who fear the runaway explosion of AI are worried about the fact that AI will result in computers being able to write their own programs. Okay, they're going to be able to enter this exponential cycle of self-improvement where they're writing their own code and developing in a way that sidelines the humans. Well, I point out in my book that computers actually teach humans to program. I mentioned that I've been working on software development for 40 years. My productivity in software development is orders of magnitude higher than it was 20 years ago. And it's orders of magnitude higher in large part because of the software tools that I'm using, which teach me to program. They guide my thinking. They guide my creative processes. And of course, the people who develop these tools are developing them using these tools. So there's a feedback loop here where the tools are developing along with the mechanisms by which the tools get developed, and it's involving both the humans and the technology in this feedback loop. So this leads me to my final meme, which is we are not digital. There's a interesting aspect of this partnership between the technology and the humans, where the humans perform functions that are very complementary to what the technology performs. So when I use Google search to go and then find something, some piece of information on Stack Overflow about how to deal with a software problem, the computers are doing something that no human can do. They're sorting through this vast quantity of indexed information. No human can do that. That's not something that is replicable in the human mind. This partnership where the machines do the things that they're good at and the humans do the things that they're good at, and together they create new capabilities, it's that partnership that I'm talking about. And the reality is that many people today seem to assume that human cognitive processes are ultimately computational processes, that everything that's going on in my head is actually a digital computation. And I debunk that theory in my book. I think there is no basis for that theory, and the theory is actually driven by a number of fallacies. I use the term dataism, which I borrowed from Yuval Noah Harari in his book Homo Deus, and I say that this is in fact a faith, not a scientific principle. One of the fallacies that drives this thinking is what I call the universal machine fallacy. The idea that computer scientists know about the universal Turing machine. And many people, you can find many books out there today that drop the word Turing from this and say simply universal machine, that this is a machine that can do anything that any other machine can do. That's simply not true. A universal Turing machine can do anything that a Turing machine can do, and Turing machines have particular properties. They're algorithmic, which means that their processes are discrete step-by-step operations. They're digital, and they're terminating, and human beings share only one of those three properties, the terminating one. There's also the DNA fallacy. DNA is digital. A human DNA molecule encodes about 2 gigabytes of data. That's not a whole lot of data. So the assumption here is that since that's digital, it must be that ultimately humans are digitally defined. But I'd like to point out that every human alive today is the endpoint of a continuous, unbroken biological process dating back 4 billion years. So me, right here, digitally mediated with you, as a biological process, I am simply a point in a process that started 4 billion years ago and has been completely uninterrupted for that 4 billion years. Any interruption, and I wouldn't be here. That continuous biological process is capable of carrying vastly more information than is in the DNA. In fact, I showed in my previous book, Plato and the Nerd, I developed the story that the actual amount of information that can be conveyed by that process is infinitely more than what is in the human DNA molecule. There's also the connectomics fallacy. So this dates back to the 1940s, where McCulloch and Pitts famously showed that neurons fire discretely, neurons combine to realize logic functions. Then a whole philosophy developed, led by Hilary Putnam in the 1960s, called multiple realizability, that said that two processes that realize the same logic functions are in fact identical and indistinguishable regardless of the hardware in which they run. And finally, more recently, the idea that if we could simply understand the connections in the brain, we would be able to understand these digital logic functions. So unfortunately, using this to draw the conclusion that human cognitive processes are digital and algorithmic is flawed. It ignores many of the aspects of how the human brain works. One of the things that it ignores is timing. So you can read about this in my book. I developed this counter-argument much more in depth there. So in conclusion, technology has a huge impact on humanity. We're certainly seeing an acceleration today of the coevolution of humans and technology. It's, in fact, in coevolutionary processes, in Darwinian evolution, it's, you know, again, the classical view, the view that I used to have was that it was a slow process, that random mutations would occur and make small mutations that would then result in possibly a slightly evolved organism faring better. That's not actually how it works. It's more like a punctuated equilibrium. There's major disruptions in the ecosystem that cause very rapid coevolutionary processes. And we're seeing that right now with our coevolution with technology. And I don't think we're ever going to go back to the relationship that we had with technology before this pandemic. Many of these changes are in fact going to be permanent. The fact that we have less control than we think should not be disheartening. It should be a dose of realism. If we're going to regulate technology development, for example, we need to understand how technology development works. If we think of it as digital creationism, we're going to develop the wrong policies, and we're going to develop ineffective policies. Because if that's not the mechanism that is driving technology development, and we regulate it assuming that is the mechanism, we're going to end up with ineffective regulation. And finally, humans are not digital. And consequently, we need to celebrate our humanity even as we digitize our world. Thanks very much. I guess I turn it back to Hannes now.